The United Nations Climate Change Conferences are annual conferences held under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. It serves as the formal meeting of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, COP, to take stock of progress in dealing with climate change starting in the mid-1990s, to negotiate the Kyoto Agreement to make legally binding commitments for developed countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Each of the conferences since 2005 has been known as the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Convention, CMP. As parties to the convention that are not parties to the protocol can also participate in the protocol-related meetings as observers. The meetings between 2011 and 2015 were used to negotiate the Paris Agreement as part of the Durban Platform, which created an overall path toward climate action. Any final COP text must be approved by consensus. The first United Nations Climate Change Conference was held in 1995 in Berlin. Conference success rates are higher when they are held in sunny locations, according to Salim Al-Haq while speaking at COP26 after attending all previous COPs. COP1, Berlin, Germany. The first conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change took place from March 28 to April 7, 1995 in Berlin, Germany. 1996, COP2, Geneva, Switzerland. The second conference of the parties took place from 8 to July 19, 1996 in Geneva, Switzerland. Reference is made to his ministerial declaration, but not adopted, of July 18, 1996, which reflects the statement of the United States position made by former U.S. Undersecretary for Global Affairs Timothy Wirth at that meeting, which 1. Adopting the scientific findings on climate change presented by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its second assessment, 1995. 2. Refusal to unify coordinated policies in favor of flexibility. 3. He called for legally binding medium-term goals. 1997, COP3, Kyoto, Japan. The third conference of the parties was held in December 1997 in Kyoto, Japan. The Kyoto Agreement was adopted after extensive negotiations, which set out the commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for Annex I countries, along with what became known as Kyoto mechanisms such as emissions trading, the Clean Development Mechanism and joint implementation. Most industrialized countries and some Central European economies in transition, all defined as Annex B countries, have agreed to legally binding reductions in greenhouse gas emissions averaging 6 to 8% below 1990 levels between 2008 to 2012, which is defined as the first emissions budget period. The United States was required to reduce its total emissions by 7% below 1990 levels, but Congress did not approve the treaty after Clinton signed it. The Bush administration explicitly rejected the protocol in 2001. 1998, COP4, Buenos Aires, Argentina. The fourth COP was held in November 1998 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The remaining unresolved issues in Kyoto were assumed to be completed during this meeting. The complexity and insurmountability of reaching agreement on these issues has proven insurmountable, and the parties have instead adopted a 2-year action plan to strengthen efforts and devise mechanisms to implement the Kyoto Agreement, to be completed by 2000. At COP4, Argentina and Kazakhstan expressed their commitment to a pledge to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the first 2 countries not included in the annex to do so. 1999, COP5, Bonn, Germany. The fifth conference of the parties took place from October 25 to November 5, 1999 in Bonn, Germany. It was a technical meeting in the first place, and it didn't come up with major results. Egypt has been awarded the right to host the 27th United Nations Climate Change Conference COP27. The annual United Nations Climate Conference was originally scheduled to take place in the resort of Sharm el-Sheikh in November 2022. However, the event was rescheduled to take place between November 7 to 18, 2022, as COP26 moved from 2020 to 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Under COP27, member states will demonstrate their implementation of the commitments made under the Paris Agreement and the COP26 pledges. However, COP27 has come under scrutiny for being hosted by Egypt. Amnesty International published some of the key demands in its detailed analysis in May 2022 and stressed the states present to use the event as a means to pressure Egypt to bring about a tangible improvement in its human rights record. The non-profit organization also called for the safe, meaningful, and effective participation of actors in Egyptian and non-Egyptian civil society by avoiding the suppression of peaceful dissent and civic space. It was reported that hotels in Sharm el-Sheikh may obstruct the participation of grassroots groups and activists in the event. What is the story of all these conferences? COPs are the largest and most important annual climate conference. In 1992, the United Nations organized the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted and its coordinating agency established, what we now know as the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat. In this treaty, countries agreed to stabilize the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere to prevent dangerous interference by human activity in the climate system, and so far 197 different parties have signed it. Since 1994, when the treaty entered into force, the United Nations has annually convened nearly every country on Earth to attend the World Climate Summits, known as COP, which means Conference of the Parties. During these meetings, countries negotiated various annexes to the original treaty to set legally binding limits on emissions, for example, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 and the Paris Agreement adopted in 2015, in which all countries of the world agreed to step up efforts in order to try to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures, and boosting climate finance. This year marks the 27th annual summit, or COP27. How is COP27 different from other conferences? Last year's COP26 conference culminated in the Glasgow Climate Charter, which came 5 years after the signing of the Paris Agreement and which kept the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius alive, but with a weak pulse, as the UK presidency declared at the time. Progress has been made to make the Paris Agreement fully functional, by finalizing the details of its practical implementation, also known as the Paris Rulebook. At COP26 countries agreed to make stronger commitments this year, including updated national plans with more ambitious targets, yet only 23 of 193 countries have submitted their plans to the United Nations so far. Glasgow has also seen many pledges made both inside and outside the negotiating rooms regarding net zero commitments, forest protection, and climate finance, among many other issues. According to the presidential vision statement, COP27 will be about moving from negotiation and planning to implementation of all these promises and pledges that have been made. Egypt has called for full, comprehensive, wide-ranging, and timely action on the ground. According to the experts, besides reviewing how the Paris Rulebook is implemented, the conference will also see negotiations on some of the sticking points after the Glasgow conference. These issues include financing loss and damage so that countries on the front lines of the crisis can deal with the consequences of climate change beyond their capacity to adapt, and fulfilling promises of $100 billion each year for adaptation financing in low-income countries by developed countries. The negotiations will also include technical discussions, for example, to determine how countries should in practice measure their emissions so that there is a level playing field for all. All of these discussions will pave the way for the first global assessment at COP28, which in 2023 will assess collective global progress on mitigation, adaptation, and ways to implement the Paris Agreement. Air pollution does not recognize political boundaries, so improving air quality requires continuous and coordinated government action and an attempt to reduce emissions by 25% by 2030. Archive. What are the main objectives of the conference? 1. Mitigation. How are countries reducing their emissions? Climate change mitigation refers to efforts to reduce or prevent the emission of greenhouse gases. Mitigation can mean using new technologies and renewable energy sources, making old equipment more energy efficient, or changing management practices or consumer behavior. Countries are expected to show how they plan to implement the Glasgow Charter's call to review their climate plans and create mitigation action programs. This means offering more ambitious targets on emissions for 2030. As the United Nations climate change body has said, current plans are still insufficient to avoid catastrophic warming. Adaptation. How will countries adapt to climate change and help others do so? Climate change is there. In addition to doing everything we can to reduce emissions and slow the pace of global warming, countries must also adapt to climate consequences so that they can protect their citizens. The repercussions vary by location. This could mean the risk of more fires, floods, or droughts, hotter or colder days, or a rise in sea levels. At COP26, delegates adopted a work program around the global adaptation goal set out in the Paris Agreement. The plan is designed to provide communities and countries with the knowledge and tools to ensure that their adaptation actions actually lead the world toward a more resilient future with climate change. The COP27 presidency expects countries to identify and assess their progress toward enhancing resilience and helping the most vulnerable communities. This means that countries make more detailed and ambitious commitments to the adaptation components of their national climate plans. Last year, developed countries agreed to at least double adaptation funding, and many stakeholders are calling for greater levels of adaptation funding to match the amounts now being spent on mitigation, as stipulated in the Paris Agreement. This will certainly be the subject of great discussions at the Sharm el-Sheikh conference. The United Nations Climate Change Panel stresses that significantly increasing the volume of adaptation financing from all sources, public and private, is important in order to respond to current and future climate risks. Therefore, all players, including governments, financial institutions, and the private sector, must be involved. Developed countries promise to mobilize $100 billion each year to adapt to climate change. 3. Climate finance, the elephant that never leaves the negotiating room. Climate finance will be a major topic again during COP27, and many discussions related to finance are already on the agenda, as developing countries make a strong appeal to developed countries to secure appropriate and adequate financial support, especially for the most vulnerable. The annual pledge by developed countries of $100 billion a year, which has yet to be fulfilled, is likely to be touched upon a lot. In 2009 in Copenhagen, rich countries committed to this funding, but official reports still show that this goal has not been achieved. Experts expect COP27 to finally make this pledge a reality in 2023. The Egyptian presidency aims to follow up on these and other commitments made in previous conferences of the parties. What is the loss and damage issue that we hear about so often? Climate change, through extreme weather events such as tropical cyclones, desertification, and sea level rise, is causing costly damage to countries. Because the intensification of these natural disasters is caused by the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, most of which are from the rich industrial countries, the developing countries, often the most affected, assert that they must receive compensation. Denmark made headlines during the last high-level week of the United Nations General Assembly after becoming the first country to announce its intention to provide $13 million to developing countries that have suffered damages from climate change. The issue of these loss and damages payments will likely be the subject of much debate during COP27, even if it has not been formally placed on the agenda yet. The Group of 77 and China, which roughly includes all developing countries, asked to be added to the agenda, which would require consensus by all countries on the first day of the talks. There have been discussions about creating a loss and damage fund, but it has not yet translated into anything tangible. Experts, including the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights in the Context of Climate Change, Ian Fry, hope to build further momentum and achieve the fund. There are major developed countries that are very concerned about this and are looking at this issue in terms of what the polluter will pay, Mr. Fry said in a recent interview with the UN News team. So it's time for the big countries, the major emitters, to stand up and say, we have to do something, we have to make a contribution to these weak countries. What effect did the war in Ukraine have on all this? According to Ilana Syed, Palau's permanent representative to the United Nations and climate negotiator, this COP would be confusing given the current social and political landscape and the energy crisis. The war happened in Ukraine, so there are a lot of things that many countries agreed to, and now they can't do. The landscape has changed as a result of the war, she explained. In fact, the Russian invasion of Ukraine contributed to increased inflation and exacerbated the energy and food crises around the world. Countries such as Germany have had to scale back their short-term climate targets, while the historic China-US Climate Working Group announced in Glasgow has been suspended. COP27 is likely to see a setback in the pledges and commitments made by some countries last year. However, for Special Rapporteur Ian Fry, war can also serve as a wake-up call for nations to achieve energy self-sufficiency. The Special Rapporteur says the cheapest way to do this is through renewable energy sources, which are essential to reducing emissions. Speaking to UN News, he said, "We see Portugal moving towards 100% renewable energy, and we know Denmark is doing that too, and I think that will push other countries to see the need to be renewable and energy self-sufficient." Will civil society participate in the COP or just delegates? The main event will be held at the Sharm el-Sheikh International Convention Center from 6 to 18 November. So far, more than 30,000 representatives of governments, businesses, NGOs, and civil society groups are registered to attend the conference. The 197 parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change are often in collective bargaining groups or blocs, such as the Group of 77 and China, the African Group, the Least Developed Countries, the Global Forum, Small Island Developing States, the Independent Alliance of Latin America and Africa Caribbean Sea. The negotiations also feature non-official monitors who conduct interventions and help maintain transparency, including UN agencies, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, religious groups, and the press. But in addition to the formal negotiations, there will be meeting rooms, pavilions, and there will be thousands of side events that will be divided into thematic days. This year's themes are finance, science, youth and future generations, decarbonization, adaptation and agriculture, gender, water, civil society, energy, biodiversity, and solutions, the latest COP theme. As usual, the conference will be held in two regions, the Blue Zone and the Green Zone, which this year are located opposite each other. The Blue Zone is a UN-administered space where negotiations are hosted, and all attendees must be issued tickets by the UNFCCC Secretariat for entry. This year, there will be 156 suites inside the Blue Zone, double the number in Glasgow. Several UN agencies, countries, and regions will be represented, and there will also be, for the first time, a youth and agri-food pavilion. The Green Zone is managed by the Egyptian government and is open to the registered public. It will include events, exhibitions, workshops, and talks to promote dialogue, awareness, education, and commitment to climate action. According to the presidency, the Green Zone will serve as a platform on which the business community, youth, civil societies, indigenous peoples, academia, artists, and fashion communities from around the world can express themselves and make their voices heard. This year, the Green Zone will also include a special protest area, a huge outdoor lounge and balcony space. Negotiators pose for a group photo at the conclusion of the UN Climate Summit COP26, which opened in Glasgow, Scotland, on October 31st. The conference sought to reach new global commitments to address climate change. In the end, we thank you for your follow-up. Please subscribe to the channel and do the bell button, and don't forget to like.